the most controversial section of the Doctrine and Covenants. Section 132.
Who wrote it? That's an interesting question.
Paul Fields
is an expert in stylometry.
And each of those spheres are the words of a speaker. The claim is that someone other than Joseph Smith added the plural marriage verses. They say, well, it just doesn't sound like Joseph Smith's style. It seems gruff and it seems rough. That's a qualitative analysis. Let's take a look at it objectively.
Stylometry, how would you define it?
We're not looking for what an author is saying, but how an author is saying it. Your experiences of life have molded the way you think. And that's reflected in the way that a person writes.
Some people even saying that it couldn't even come from God. What have the results of this done to you personally?
Well, we spent a long time doing this. Brigham Young is closest, but not close. It's miles away. Only strengthens my testimony of the gospel.
Were there any results that you were surprised of? Some people wrestle with some of these things. If Joseph didn't write it, what would that mean for the revelation itself? What made you want to study the authorship of Section 132?
It's a fascinating area. Can you actually detect from the words in a text who wrote it? And the answer is yeah. And so whenever these questions come up, it is always fascinating. We've done a number of studies. For example, authorship of the Book of Mormon is always an area that people question. And people have studied that over the years as well. Some of the history of stylometry, for example, some of the very first stylometry work that was done by a guy by the name of he was a Reverend, A.Q. Morton, and he was studying the Pauline epistles.
Okay.
Were they written by the same guy, and was that, as far as we can tell, was that the Apostle Paul? And his work basically said, yeah, they were. They are all written by the same author. Some years later, about 100 years later, there was a question that historians have always had about the Federalist Papers. 12 of the Federalist Papers had disputed authorship. Hamilton said he wrote them. Madison said he wrote them, but they were both dead at the time. So who actually wrote them? And 1961, two statisticians by the name of Mosteller and Wallace, they said, okay, let's study this quantitatively. Let's use statistical methods that we now call stylometry to find out who wrote them. Are they more like Hamilton or are they more like Madison? And the answer is, it turns out they're more like Madison, almost without any question.
Interesting.
Now, that was in 1961, and so back then they didn't have computers like we have today, and so they had to do all of this statistical work by hand. Amazing. Well, about 20 years later, in 1980, two statistics professors at BYU, Wayne Larson and Al Rincher, and they had a graduate student, his name was at the time a graduate student named Tim Lawson, and they said, well, let's do the same thing for the Book of Mormon. Are there distinctive speaking patterns in the Book of Mormon? And do they match up with the speakers according to the narrative in the text? And so they used computers to be able to do the similar work that Mosteller and Wallace did. And Tim Layton was the guy who crunched the numbers for his two professors. And the answer was they looked at 5 speakers in the Book of Mormon.
Okay.
They looked at Mormon, of course.
Yeah.
Number 1. Number 2 is Nephi. Number 3 is Alma. Number 4 is Moroni. And then last of all, Jacob. And yes, there were 5 distinctive styles, and they matched exactly the speakers as identified in the text.
Consistently.
Consistently. Just amazing. And also, they tested to see if Joseph Smith's speaking and writing style was in the Book of Mormon, and it's not.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So Joseph Smith has a distinct writing style.
And she had a distinctive writing style. And in fact, it was Wayne Larson who coined the phrase, and in the stylometric phase, word print, as analogous to a fingerprint. That's where it came from. It came from that Book of Mormon study.
So you've been studying this for years. You've been interested in this. This is a huge part of your career is studying stylometry. And when it comes to the Book of Mormon, when it comes to all of these different texts that are in history, it's fascinating to you. to be able to study these, to be able to determine the distinctive voices within those texts?
Oh, yeah, I've been doing it for well over 20 years.
Wow. And so now, whether people are reading this now and Come Follow Me, or even in general, Section 132, the question has arisen, I guess, did Joseph Smith write it? And so you're saying that he, based on this method of stylometry, we could tell if he has a distinct voice. Is that correct?
We can tell that Joseph Smith did not write the Book of Mormon.
Yeah.
Other claims have been made over the years. I mean, even before the Book of Mormon was actually published, people were making claims about its origin.
Yeah.
And one of the most frequent, and continues to come up even to this day, 200 years later almost, is that it is a plagiarism of the famous, or now infamous, Spalding manuscript.
That's right.
And that Sidney Rigdon had some role in that. And so that's been studied over the years. We did a study on that a few years ago. And no, it's not, there isn't any connection between the Book of Mormon text and the Spalding manuscript.
Yeah.
Neither is Sidney Rigdon, nor Oliver Cowdery, nor Joseph Smith's word print, their styles in the Book of Mormon.
And also the Book of the Hebrews, correct? Isn't it also another one?
The Book of the Hebrews was one of the first claims, yes.
But you're saying, regardless of what it is, there's a way to detect the distinct style within an author, that an author has. And in those books, Joseph Smith didn't appear.
Yeah.
Based on the research.
Yeah, we look for markers, style markers. When you see, writing is thinking, and thinking is writing. And so the way you think is the way you write. And so all of your training, your education, your experiences of life have molded the way you think. And that's unique to you because you have had your unique training and education and experiences of life. And that's reflected in the way that a person writes. And so we look for some indications of that. Sentence length is one of those. Hemingway is very distinctive in the lengths of his sentences. They're very long. Other writers don't write sentences that long as Hemingway, and some write very short, choppy sentences. So that's a characteristic of style. Vocabulary richness. How many words does an author use? Which ones does an author seem to favor? And in particular, we have found that function words or grammatical words are very distinctive of an authorial style. Now, grammatical words are words that don't carry any semantic meaning. They are just the structure that an author uses to convey the message that he or she wants to portray. So, function words are words like and, conjunctions, or, the, but, and, a. So they're prepositions, conjunctions, determiners, articles, interrogatives, exclamations.
That give emphasis, that give style.
But not nouns, adjectives, verbs, or adverbs, because those are semantic, they carry meaning. And so we're not looking for what an author is saying, but how an author is saying it.
Yeah. And that's what makes that's technically what makes it's the style.
That's what makes it style.
So it's the study of that. So that's helpful for us to understand, right? That stylometry, how would you define it?
Stylometry is the measurement of style. Style, metric, stylometry, the measurement of style.
That's
amazing. So we measure it objectively using statistics, and we're looking at written text.
So we can look at section 132, and we could perform the same test.
So if there was a claim about the authorship of 132, we could look at the style in 132 and compare it to the style in whomever might be claimed as the author.
Just a quick note before we go further, what we're talking about here, it's the data, it's the authorship, it's the voice of revelation. This is just one piece of a much bigger puzzle. Now, the full article, there's gonna be a few that Paul and a couple of his colleagues, Matt Roper here from Scripture Central is also a part of it. You'll find a link to those articles below. What we've also added is some other trusted resources that are gonna cover more of the history, the doctrine, and the lived experiences that surround the topic of section 132. So, if you want to understand it fully, take some time to explore those links after this, and I think that you'll see how everything connects. I hope that it's helpful. We'll get right back to our conversation.
Why do you think it divides people? And I know that you are an expert in stylometry, but what is it that makes this revelation so divisive for there to be a need to even consider who was the author?
Well, it seems to me that the issue is one of authorship, because it talks about plural marriage, and about half of the verses are about plural marriage, and some people have difficulty with that doctrine.
Yeah, and I know that I just want to make that clear at the very beginning. I know that you're a statistician, right? And I mean, but I think that for some people it's interesting because when it comes to this, it's almost as if the arguments are made with the mind, right? Logic, right? In theory, but then also you have the heart. And it's like coming to these conversations, oftentimes there might be people might feel a certain way about it, and it might affect the way they see it, and vice versa.
Of course.
Right?
So that's why stylometry is important in answering these questions, because it's objective.
Yeah.
It takes the heart out of it. It takes the mind out of it. The emotions aren't there.
Yeah.
Let's take a look at the text. Let's see what the text actually contains. There's some people who have for years maintained, for example, that Brigham Young's style seems to be in section 132. Mm-hmm. They say, well, it just doesn't sound like Joseph Smith's style.
People would say this.
People have said that.
Interesting.
Yeah. And
what about it what about his style are they saying is not the same?
Yeah. So they say in 132, it seems gruff, and it seems rough, and it seems like someone is speaking who doesn't have the same sense of poetic fluency that Joseph Smith's words have.
Interesting.
Well, that's a qualitative analysis. And so we're saying, let's take a look at it quantitatively, objectively. Is the style of Joseph Smith or Brigham Young or Oliver Cowdery or Sidney Rigdon or whomever you might put up as a candidate as an author of it, how do they compare? It's what we call a goodness of fit test. We have the profile in the text, and we have the profile of an author, and we see, do they fit or not fit?
So we know that some people think that because of this, it could have been Brigham. What are some other things? What are some other, I would say, assumptions that people have about the text that you know of?
Well, the history of the text is that it was transcribed in 1843.
That's right.
Just, a year before the martyrdom. And but it wasn't presented, it wasn't put into the Doctrine and Covenants at that time. It was later. Joseph said that when he dictated 132, that he had received it years earlier and had memorized it, and that he was dictating it exactly as he had received the revelation, probably 10 or 12 years earlier.
Interesting.
And so it was transcribed and written down as he dictated it. Mm-hmm. And then, but that copy was lost. We're not exactly sure what happened to it, but it was then rewritten by another scribe, and that's the copy that we have. But it was stuck in a drawer, and the martyrdom came, and the exodus to the west came, and so it was 3 or 4 years later where it was then pulled out of the drawer, so to speak, and finally presented to the church as a revelation and as a doctrine of the church. And so that story of providence is what the church describes as where it came from. And other people have said, well, in that chain of custody, a lot of things could have happened.
Could have been edited?
Yeah, it could have been edited. So it could have been Brigham Young, could have been William Clayton, could be one of the other scribes by the name of Kingsbury. It could be Newell K. Whitney, the bishop, and who was asked for it to be transcribed and copied. So in all of those, of all of those possible people who had handled it, had it in their possession, maybe someone else had written it. That's the question.
And then I think what I've even heard of, some people even saying that it couldn't even come from God, right? That with that being said, if it was edited, if it was changed, then the revelation wouldn't have even come from God at all, right? But that's what I think makes this a little bit more complex. The issue of plural marriage and the challenge of people to receive it, right? You know,
some people like to make the contention that the plural marriage part was not in the original transcript. That was added later by Brigham Young. And that wasn't Joseph Smith's revelation. It came from Brigham Young. But my contention is, it's the doctrine of the church. And Brigham Young was a prophet. Joseph Smith was a prophet. So where it came from, whether it was one prophet or the other, is not relevant.
Interesting, yeah.
But it is interesting to see who wrote it. That's an interesting question. Well, it is the doctrine of the church, and whether it was Brigham Young or Joseph Smith, it was from a prophet.
But isn't there more at stake though if Joseph writes it, right? Because he's the prophet, the head of this dispensation. He's the prophet who was the beginning, the catalyst of this restoration, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that's important to note. When people look at this, I think it helps us understand a little bit more of what's at stake whenever we look at who is the author.
Well, I mean, you can say, how deeply do the roots of plural marriage go in the history of the church and in the history of the restoration? Mm. Was it 1850 or was it 1830? Mm. So there's a 20-year time span in there where you could say, well, maybe that makes some difference. Yeah. And so we can investigate that.
So we can investigate it. This is an interesting question to consider. I mean, if Joseph didn't write it, what would that mean for the revelation itself if he didn't write it?
I don't think it means anything. I mean, it's still the doctrine of the church, and it still came through a prophet of the Lord.
If it were from someone else.
And from Joseph Smith, the next 6 presidents of the church, the next 6 prophets of the church practiced plural marriage.
So there's a lot on the table. I think it's important. I'm glad that we took the time to mention these things because, and I want to make clear, you're a statistician. You're not here to give your opinions on plural marriage. We're looking at the data. There's going to be other pieces of content that we will make that will go more in depth of that and to help people understand. I think it does naturally bring up questions.
I can share with you my personal view, and that is the church is true. The restoration occurred. It was 100% restoration. Joseph Smith was a prophet. Brigham Young was a prophet. Wilford Woodruff was a prophet.
Yeah.
My priesthood line of authority from the 12 apostles goes Brigham Young, George Buchanan, Heber J. Grant, Spencer Kimball, and my father. And the first 3 of those were all prophets of the church. The first 4 of those were all apostles. And the first 3 practiced plural marriage. So it's part of my ancestry as well.
I think this is really interesting, to be honest. I think this is fascinating. I think that the idea of, the more that I've researched it, when I read your paper that's coming out, or it's currently, if you're watching this or reading this now or listening to this now, it's in the Interpreter right now. It really addresses this question of if he wrote it or not, and it helps us to see. I don't know. I don't want to overemphasize this, but the fact that Joseph wrote it to me, I think matters a lot. I think it really does. I think it really does matter a lot versus Brigham because of who Joseph is and his responsibility in the restoration, And I believe that he's a prophet. I know that he's a prophet. God's witnessed that to me too. And
all I'm saying is it doesn't change my testimony of the gospel.
Yeah.
Whoever wrote it, or excuse me, whichever of the prophets wrote it. But it is interesting. Yes. Is there evidence in the document itself that supports or contradicts the claimed provenance of that, the history of that document?
So let's change gears. Let's look at the process. Okay, how do we isolate Joseph's voice specifically? As you look through the data, help us, give us some background. You've already given us some on how stylometry works, what it is. Mm-hmm. When you're looking at this data now and you want to determine how can we know if this is Joseph Smith's voice, how do you approach that data? What's the first thing you do?
Well, we're going to take a look at the text itself, and as I was describing, we'll count up the word profile, the word use profile in that document. In this case, 132.
Yeah.
Now, because of the question that we have with 132, There's a plural marriage portion and a non-plural marriage portion.
So there's two sections of this section.
It's about 50-50.
50-50.
And so we divide it up into those two pieces. And we look at the profile there to see if the same word profile is present in both pieces of 132.
And what's the significance and the reason why you want to divide up those two sections?
Well, because of this question of plural marriage. The claim is that someone other than Joseph Smith added the plural marriage verses.
So that second half that we have, some of the assumptions are that was added after the fact.
That's what is the claim.
And so we're looking at the two and seeing if there's any similarities within the two.
Are they the same or not?
Okay. So we're doing that. What else?
Which would indicate the same author of one half and the other half.
So as you're looking at it, what do you find?
Well, and then we need to compare that to the word print, the word profile in candidate authors.
Who are the candidate authors we're looking at?
For example, we could look at Joseph Smith. And we have his revelations, his other revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants.
Okay.
And we can look at the revelations about that same time that 132 was transcribed. That was 1843. So we can look at the revelations about that same period of time in Nauvoo. We could also look at revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants from the Kirtland period.
Okay.
As early as 1831.
Okay.
And see what the word style is there. And those are known to be Joseph Smith. No one argues that.
So the time matters, because if the claim is, if we're looking at the word print or the word, the style of writing of Joseph, if we're comparing the 43 when it came out to him saying, the revelation came to me in 1831.
Exactly.
You can now actually compare the words in 1831.
So whatever the style is in 132, is it a Nauvoo period style or is it a Kirtland period style? Are they different? Maybe they're the same.
And it's important to note here too, right? And again, I know we mentioned this before, that anyone, it changes over time, right? And it can change over time. But if you look at them in those periods, they should line up, correct?
Well, we're going to see where they line up.
So we're looking to see if they line up. You're looking at the data. You're looking at the different time periods. What else?
Well, and then we have Joseph Smith's non-revelatory sections of the Doctrine and Covenants. So there's some epistles. There's some instructions. What's the style there? Is it the same as his revelatory style?
Interesting.
And we have found in many of our studies that the prophets do speak differently when they're speaking for the Lord. We're not saying he's using that he uses the Lord's speaking style, but he speaks differently when he's speaking for the Lord than he does when he's speaking for himself.
He really does.
Yeah, Joseph Smith has a different revelatory style than his personal style. So does Brigham Young, and we've seen that with the other prophets as well. John Taylor.
What is the distinction? That's interesting. What are some of the things that, for example, let's take Joseph, for example. What are some of the key attributes of the style of when he's speaking for himself versus when he's speaking for the Lord?
Yeah, and that's always one of the questions that we have is what is the difference of style? And do they prefer conjunctions or prepositions or other words than they would use otherwise? I should mention the grammatical words that we're looking for, that we're testing, where we're looking for the word profile. There's about 250 of those in the English language. They're a closed set. We don't add or subtract to those. Nouns and verbs, we make those up all the time.
Yeah.
If I were to say, let's go Zoom today, that has something much different than if I said it 20 years ago or even 5 years ago.
Yeah. Interesting.
So we add
semantics.
We add nouns and verbs, but we don't add words, grammatical words, the ands, the conjunctions, the prepositions, and so on. And to that set, when we're doing our analysis, we add some of the more archaic words, the King James Version of the Bible type words like thee and thou and so forth. So that adds about another 14 words. So our close set of words that we use in our analyses is 264 words. So we're looking for which of those words does an author prefer, and they prefer different words when they're talking as the mouthpiece of the Lord than when they're talking as themselves personally.
So if we take Joseph, what are some of the words that he would prefer more when talking
Well,
to the Lord?
the more archaic words.
The more archaic words.
For example.
Interesting.
There is this flavor of the King James Bible vocabulary.
And even when I look at the Book of Mormon, I would sometimes wonder if some of the words that he's almost like the words of the Lord from the Scripture, they appear in the revelation. Like as he's studying the Book of Mormon, as he's translating it, I notice just personally as I study, there's some similar phrasing that you find in the Bible.
Yeah, and
right?
and so those are the characteristics that we're looking for. So yeah, there's characteristic style between authors, differences of style between authors, but also within genre and types of text.
So there's a difference between the prophetic style and the personal style. With Joseph, he used more archaic words. And did you find the same for Brigham Young?
Yeah.
And most of the prophets.
But his revelatory style is much different from Joseph's revelatory style.
So even though there is a differentiation between within themselves, right, the personal and their revelatory style, the revelatory styles in comparison are different, way different.
Yep.
Okay. Who else were the candidates? Joseph Smith, Brigham Young.
Well,
who else did we compare?
And all the people who had touched the document in some way. So William Clayton, for example, who was a scribe in Kingsbury, and Newell K. Whitney, and we've looked at 13 different candidate authors. Well, including, however, Joseph Smith's revelatory and non-revelatory, and Brigham Young's revelatory and non-revelatory. All of those together makes 13 different candidates.
So what are some of the things that you're thinking, as you're thinking through this, what are some different angles that you have to kind of take to make sure that you're doing this properly? Because one of the things that comes up in my mind is, well, what if William Clayton tried to mimic his style?
Right.
You know?
Right.
Or is there anything else like that? That's just naturally what comes to my mind. Like, what if Kingsbury tried to mimic the style, right?
For Joseph Smith, for example, we have very little in the historical record that is actually words penned by his hand, called holographic text. We have some, but not very many, because almost everything that we have from Joseph Smith was through a scribe. And he had 23 different scribes over the years. And so one of the questions has always been, well, how much effect does the scribe have in creating the text? Because it has to go from Joseph through the scribe down on the paper. Did anything change along the way? And does the scribe try to help the process along? And so we've tested that to see how much of a scribe ends up in those texts that were dictated by Joseph Smith. Now, what we have found is that, yes, there is a scribe effect.
There is a scribe effect.
There is a scribe effect, and it's stronger with some scribes than it is with others.
So who's the scribe that's like, no, Joseph, it's like this?
Who had the greatest impact on the final document as dictated by Joseph Smith?
Clayton.
W.W. Phelps.
W.W. Phelps, really?
Well, that makes sense. He was an editor,
Interesting.
Of course. And who was next in terms of affecting the text? That was Oliver Cowdery. Well, that makes some sense too. He was a school teacher. He was an attorney. His words were his profession as well. Who had the least impact? Well, as we looked across all 20-something scribes, William Clayton had the least.
He had the least?
Yes.
And what do you think makes that difference?
Well, a scribe who says, I'm just the pen here. I'm just writing it down. You say it and I write it. So there's trying to help out.
So William W. Phelps, there were times when he would scribe for Joseph. There's times that Oliver Cowdery would scribe for Joseph, and he would kind of make his emphasis incorrect. You could see the influence.
Let's fix this a little bit.
Interesting.
Let's put another word in. Let's take a word out. Let's spell it differently. Let's put punctuation in differently.
And can you see their emphasis from their own compared? If you were to look at Oliver Cowdery and his word print, does it appear in Joseph's revelatory?
Exactly. That's what we're comparing. We're saying, all right, here's a document that we know was written by Joseph Smith. Here's a document we know was written by Oliver Cowdery. Here's a document that was dictated by the prophet and scribed by Oliver Cowdery. How much of each of those styles is in this composite document.
So we're comparing different people. We're comparing Joseph and Brigham and Kingsbury, and we're also considering even the ones that were scribed by different people and how they are distinct.
For example, we look at, in this particular study, we're looking at Joseph Smith's revelatory text from the Kirtland period, from the Nauvoo period, so that's 2. We're looking at his other texts that are in the Doctrine and Covenants that aren't revelatory, like epistles and instructions, and a 4th group, which are his words dictated and transcribed by William Clayton.
Wow.
So it's as close to his personal style as we can find.
So we're squeezing out every angle that we can. Are any angles that you look back and you're like, I wish we did it?
We're looking at all of it.
Are there any angles now that you look back and wish that you did do that you didn't?
Well, we spent a long time doing this, and so we've covered all the bases.
Covered all the bases.
Yeah.
Were there any results that you were surprised of within those variations?
I was surprised that Joseph's revelatory voice is different in 1831 and in 1841.
You were surprised?
I thought maybe it'd be the same. It's only 10 years difference, but there was a difference. They are distinctly different.
What are the major differences?
Well, the words that he emphasizes and the words that he uses, they're just not the same. And if we look at the variation amongst them, they are clearly separatable.
Clearly separated. That's interesting. Why do you think? I'm just curious to know because obviously you're just looking at the data and you're seeing the difference. What are some of the emphasis that he had?
My explanation is simply he grew as a prophet.
That makes sense to me.
And he was a different prophet at the end of his mission than he was at the beginning.
What are some of the things that you're seeing that he's growing in that you see just looking at the data?
If you'll remember, we're only looking at the grammatical words. So it's not really a sense of being more or less poetic or more or less explanatory. It's more how well things are structured. And it seems to me that when we look at the grammatical words, that there's a difference of the structure. It's more formal towards the end of his mission than at the beginning.
So he's improving in his.
He was learning how to express himself differently,
more clearly. I think this is fascinating.
I mean, it comes with practice.
He's dictating the word of God.
He's dictating
that's what we're talking about.
He's receiving the voice of the Lord as he's hearing it, and he's expressing it to us.
Can you imagine that? And I know Steve Harper's done some research on this and done a lot of, and what's the way that he describes it? It's almost like, I just imagine seeing heaven and having to, he said it's like a mind is like a prison. Isn't that what he said? Mm-hmm. With the paper in your hand and you have to dictate the things of God. So anything else that surprised you as you're looking at the research and looking at the objective data?
Well, I wasn't surprised to find that Joseph's revelatory voice was different from his personal voice. It was also somewhat surprising to me that his words transcribed by William Clayton and his non-revelatory sections of the Doctrine and Covenants, they were distinctly different as well. So when Joseph was writing a letter to Emma, for example, he spoke one way. When he was giving instructions to the church, he spoke one way. And when he was speaking for the voice of the Lord, he used a different voice.
Interesting. But and there was consistencies in all of those.
You can see the distinctive statistical difference.
So the letters that he's writing to Emma are consistently the same. The letters that he's writing to the church are consistently the same. That's interesting.
Well, and when you think about it, yeah, I speak differently to my wife than I do when I'm in the classroom. And I pray differently than when I give a lecture. So, yeah, it makes sense. It should be that way.
Well, based on the context of Section 132 and Hiram coming forth, and I think that's a lot of when he did write it, he was like, look, I'll talk to Emma about this, right? I'll write it. Let's write it down. And that's I know Anthony Sweat, he painted the painting of him delivering this revelation to Emma. What is the tone that Joseph uses when he does write to Emma? What are some of the notice? What did you notice in that pattern, that voice?
Well, one of the things that to me seemed to be distinctive is the sentence structures tended to be longer. I don't think there's any particular meaning in that. He just had more to say when he was talking to Emma. Perhaps.
Any consistencies of tone? What does that mean when the sentences are longer? Is there any meaning of that at all? I mean, does stylometry explain anything like that?
I don't see anything that's particularly noteworthy about that, but it is distinctively a different approach to communication.
So you're looking at all of this data, you're comparing it at every angle you can possibly get, right? You're looking at all the angles to the point where you've even told me, I don't think there's any angles that are necessary that we missed.
Yeah, when we're choosing the text that we want to use as comparison, we need to match them up in terms of the time periods need to match, the genre needs to match. So we want to make sure that we're always comparing apples and apples, not apples and oranges. And so we've tried to do that in this study as much as we can. Make sure that the comparisons are not creating a difference where there is no difference.
And so you're looking at the data and you're finding, what would you say is the ultimate conclusion?
Well, when we look at, if the question is do the writing styles in D&C 132, are they congruent with the church's claimed provenance of that section of the Doctrine and Covenants? The answer is, yeah. The writing styles match the church's claimed provenance of Doctrine and Covenants. The narrative matches. That there is no difference between the plural marriage and the non-plural marriage parts of 132, and they are closer to the early revelations of Joseph Smith than the later revelations of Joseph Smith, and they are far closer to all the revelations of Joseph Smith than to any of the other candidate authors. The only one who is close, and he's not close at all, is Brigham Young's revelatory voice.
So Brigham Young's revelatory voice is the closest, but what are we talking in comparison? If you were to statistically explain that to like a fifth grader.
If you were to say, how far away is Brigham Young from the distance between D&C 132 and the other early revelations of Joseph Smith, it's probably 10 times farther away.
10 times farther away.
It's not even close. It's closest, but not close.
So it's closest in comparison, but it's
relative closeness, but not close.
And if you were to visually show that, I know we can show the diagram here in a second.
Yeah.
What would that be comparison to for something that, have you thought of any analogy or metaphor of how close it would be in comparison?
Yeah, it's miles away.
Miles away. Miles. Okay.
And everybody else is like 100 miles away.
Wow. So from the data we see that it's clear that he did. And for some people, this is that fact alone that they might struggle with this, that might still be a hard truth to grasp, right?
Well, it's like anything else. I mean,
yeah.
if those who have ears can hear, and those who have eyes can see, and those who don't want to hear don't hear, and those who don't want to see don't see.
I know that you're a statistician, and I know that even just talking to you, I mean, and for myself, I mean, I believe and I know that Joseph Smith was a prophet. I'm thankful for all the work that he's done. I'm thankful for the sacrifices that he made. And I'm thankful that, I mean, can you imagine just having all your life? Everybody knows about all your strengths, your weaknesses, your triumphs, your victories, the things that were challenging. Mm-hmm. What have the results of this done to you personally, in your perspective of the restoration? These results
only strengthens my testimony of the gospel. I find that, to find that all of the objective evidence is completely in support of the church's claims for the provenance of that that section of the Doctrine and Covenants, it's all there. It's all supported. There isn't anything that is amiss.
I just think that it's interesting. You have this ability, even from a statistics perspective, you're studying the voice of the Lord through a prophet.
Mm-hmm.
What kind of impact did that have on you? I'm just curious to know. Did it have an impact on you?
And we've studied other scriptures as well. I mentioned the Book of Mormon. We did a study also recently about Alma chapter 29, and where Alma's soliloquy. And some people have said, well, is that Alma's talking, or is that Mormon talking? It's one of those two. And so we've looked at the word print of Alma in other areas of the text, and Mormon in other areas of the text, and said, all right, now whose voice is in Alma 29? It's Alma.
It's Alma.
And so, when I read it, I've always thought, well, it sounds like Alma to me. And yep, the objective information confirms that without any doubt. I mean, they're so far, Mormon is so far away that he's not really in the running at all.
But what does that mean to you?
Well, let's take another example of the Book of Mormon. Well, there's I mentioned that Rencher, Larson, and Layton did their study, and they looked at 5 of the main speakers in the Book of Mormon, the 5 biggest, who have the most words. And we've repeated that analysis now many times, but most recently with more refined statistical techniques than they had back then, and with greater computing power than they had back then. And we've been able to identify as many as 28 distinctive voices in the Book of Mormon. There's more speakers than that in the Book of Mormon, but we can find 28 distinctive styles in the Book of Mormon that match the narrative of the study. We call it from Abinadi to Xenos. And so, Abinadi is at one end and Xenos is at the other end, and they're much different from each other.
The allegory.
And
it's different.
You can look at Jacob 5. You can look at any one of the sections, and the speaking style, the writing style, matches the narrative in every case. The Book of Mormon was translated and published in 1830. So how does that compare to the other literature of the time? If people want to claim that it's simply a novel of the 19th century, how does it compare to 19th century novels? So we've made that comparison as well. And we've taken a look at Jane Austen and Charles Dickens from England, UK, Britain, British authors. We looked at Mark Twain and James Fenimore Cooper, American authors. Look at 2 novels of each of them. So that's 8 novels in comparison. Now, one of the questions is, well, all right, so can an author actually create speaker voices? Voices that are distinctly different from each other and different from the author's voice? And the answer is, yeah, a skilled author can. Charles Dickens, known as one of the great character creators of all time. Yeah, his characters in Great Expectations speak differently than each other, and they speak differently than Charles Dickens. The same with Jane Austen.
How many of them?
Each of those authors can create a distinctive pattern that separates their characters, but they all group together. Jane Austen's characters are over here.
Interesting.
Really? And
the
Charles Dickens are over here. They group together, but there's a similarity internal to each of them, but they are separate within each other.
But there's an aggregate that comes from that.
And the British speaker, the British authors, novelists, and the American novelists, they are separated as well. But here's what's interesting. If you take a look at the variation of all of those 19th century novels and the speaker voices created by those genius, greatest of all time authors, and compare it to the Book of Mormon, the speakers inside the Book of Mormon, They're separated, distinctively different. The Book of Mormon is not a 19th century author, a novel rather, and the variation amongst those speakers is greater than all of the characters created by those four novelists of all time.
That they created.
Of all time. Well, yep. And so
what does that mean?
Well, what it means is if you want to claim that the Book of Mormon is a product of Joseph Smith, that he was the author of that text, then you have to be willing to say that he's the greatest author of the 19th century, even better than Charles Dickens, Jane Austen, Mark Twain, and James Fenimore Cooper combined. Well, that's hard to say for a uneducated farm boy on the western frontier of the United States.
He was a pretty smart guy, though.
He's a pretty smart guy.
But he would have been like...
Was he that smart?
So either he was a genius. So you're saying the difference between them over here, within those who made them themselves, even though there's distinction between the characters they created, if you look at it in comparison to the Book of Mormon, they're not even close.
They're not even close.
Generally, in comparison, statistically, but even within them, they're even farther apart dramatically.
Oh, yeah.
Wow. So you're looking at that in your study of stylometry and how fascinating that is to your witness of the Book of Mormon also as well.
The Book of Mormon is not a creation of Joseph Smith, and it's not a novel from the 19th century.
Statistically and
shown,
from what you've...
Shown statistically.
Wow. I even heard that, and I don't know if we'll use this, but I think this is just interesting while I'm talking to you, okay? In Moroni, I never knew, and I don't know if this was from your research, but I know John Hilton had mentioned it before at one point. At the end of Moroni, he's quoting other authors, other prophets in chapter 10. Was that your research?
Well, several people have looked at that, yes.
So what is that? What is he doing there? In Moroni chapter 10, he's quoting. Who is he referencing in Moroni 10?
To me, it's Moroni's testimony at the end, where he's trying to wrap everything up, and it's sort of like his summary, where he's saying, "I've read all of these plates for the last 1,000 years. I know it's on all of them, and here is the message that's contained in all of this record."
And what is that message?
Well, that Jesus is the Christ.
And he said it, and so did he.
And he said, and we've it is our heritage, it is our history for the last 1,000 years.
If we look at 132, and maybe, I don't know if this would apply, what characteristics that you notice in the consistencies of it being through a prophet, the word of God?
If someone is asking this question, this is claimed to be a revelation, does it fit with the other revelations? And the answer is yes, it does. And so it would be hard to say, again, it's a creation of somebody other than a prophet.
Yeah. What are the elements that make those connections, that make it the same?
Well, it's simply the grammatical structure.
The grammatical structure of it.
That in 132 is in no way different, is distinguishable from the grammatical structure in Joseph Smith's other revelations at the time that he claims he received the revelation. This is a high-dimensional problem.
Okay.
Because we have all the 264 grammatical words that we're going to be looking at, and so we're counting up the frequency within which those words occur in all of the text.
Okay.
So you could think of this as 264 dimensions. But
how many?
264, one for each of the
words.
Yeah.
Okay.
But we're looking at 13 sets of text for Joseph Smith, Brigham Young, William Clayton, and everyone else. Even at the least, we're looking at 13 different dimensions.
Okay.
So what does a 13-dimensional space look like? I don't know.
Wow.
So what we're
That's
doing,
not what this is?
So what we're doing statistically is we're going to take that and we're going to project it down into fewer dimensions that we can actually see.
Okay.
This is the same as making a map. You take a three-dimensional globe and flatten it down into 2 dimensions and it becomes a map. Well, we're doing the same thing here.
Okay.
But we're not going to 2 dimensions. We're going to go to 3 dimensions.
Okay.
So that's what we're seeing here. So there's a function A, function B, and function C.
Okay.
Those are the dimensions. How are they? What do they represent? Okay. So function A is the dimension that creates the greatest separation amongst these 13 candidates' texts.
Okay.
Separates them the most.
Okay.
B is the dimension that separates them with the next greatest variation, and C is the third greatest variation.
So they're in that order.
And they're in that order, A, B, C.
And what would be an A function? Is it a certain type of word?
No,
or is it just wherever it falls?
It's the group of texts.
Okay.
And so if we look at the A function on the right-hand side versus the left-hand side,
okay,
we're looking at the revelations of Joseph Smith, early and late.
Okay.
They're separated the most.
Okay.
The B function separates Joseph Smith's revelations towards the bottom from Brigham Young's revelatory voice at the top.
Okay.
C separates the Joseph Smith, his revelatory voice and his non-revelatory voice. And so everything at the bottom of the graph is Joseph Smith, and everything at the top, as you're looking at with B being vertical, is Brigham Young.
Okay.
And so Brigham Young is up here, and Joseph Smith is way down here. That's why I was saying earlier that Brigham Young is just miles away. He's nowhere close to all of the Joseph Smith text down towards the bottom.
Wow. And what are the words that we're talking? Is it a qualitative, like a word map? Or are they counting the words? Are we counting the consistencies? What is it what are the actual variables that we're putting on the graph?
We can look at which are the words frequencies that are different, but again, they have no meaning.
That's right,
because they're just grammatical words. So, just to paint an example, perhaps, and in this analysis isn't necessarily the case, but perhaps Joseph Smith uses the word "and" more than Brigham Young does, and Brigham Young uses the word "the" more than Joseph Smith does. What does that mean? It doesn't mean anything other than that one person is talking and he talks differently than the other guy.
Yeah. And that's what you see as you look at the graph.
And that's what we're looking at.
In the aggregate, in the consistencies,
differences.
That's how far apart they are.
Yeah, just the structure of how they want to express themselves. And so then to those 13, we add two more texts, and that's the two sections or the two portions of section 132, the plural marriage and the non-plural marriage sections. So where do they fall relative to Joseph Smith and Brigham Young? They line up with Joseph Smith, far away from Brigham Young, and close to Joseph Smith's early Kirtland period revelations.
And so what does this mean?
Well, it means that the churches claim that they are a revelation from Joseph Smith is supported, and any claim that it was the authorship of Brigham Young is not supported, and the claim that it was a revelation given in the early period of Joseph's ministry rather than later when it was written down is also supported.
Wow. As I said before, and I'll mention this again, I think this is very fascinating. I'm thankful that you're willing to share this research. You have your paper that you've written with other authors. Can you just say their names? It's Matt Roper and Larry.
The paper is Historical and Stylometric Evidence for the Authorship of Doctrine and Covenants 132. That's the name of the paper. It's written by myself, Paul J. Fields, Stephen T. Dinsley Jr., Matt Roper, and Larry Bassist.
And we're going to have a variety of different pieces of content in relation to Section 132. This isn't the only thing. This is one piece of the puzzle. So make sure you stick around to hear more of those. I believe what you said is true. I was in this way. I know what you said is true. I'm thankful that we have a prophet, Joseph Smith. I know that this isn't always easy for people. Some people wrestle with some of these things, and that's okay. But as I always say, don't take our word for it. It's up to you to find out for yourself. This is Let's Get Real. I'm Stephen Jones. Stay tuned. There's more to come on Scripture Central as well. Until next time.